Welcome to our annual history conference. I'm Amy Berry. I work for State History, and I actually am the Cemetery and Burials Program Manager. If any of you knew that we did that, raise your hand. Not enough. So the state has mandated that I do a few things. One is I collect burial information from cemeteries and I put them in a database. So I have over 690,000 burial records throughout the state. It is never complete, ever, and it's always an ongoing thing, but it's a free resource. It's on our website. You can use it at any time. It's a great additional resource from cemetery records. So they're official records augmented with other historical research that I do. I also run a preservation component program to that for physical historical preservation of cemetery and historical conservation of assets in the cemetery, such as headstones and things like that. So if you're ever interested in those things, or you come across an opportunity you want to investigate for those things, I'm your resource. So I'm really glad to see a full room. I was really excited when I got my job because it meant I could spend my time in cemeteries and have more of a valid reason. When people ask me, what are you wandering around for? I didn't have to make up something. So I'm really glad that we have this panel today. I'm going to introduce our speakers, read you a short bio of them. We're going to hold our questions and answers until the very end. So if you want to make notations or whatnot, please just keep those in your head so that when we're done, we have enough time allotted to do a full question and answer series. All right, so we have Linda Thatcher, who is formerly of the Utah Division of State History. Her title of her presentation is Cemeteries and Changing Burial Practices. Linda is retired from Utah State History. She is the co-editor with Roger D. Lanius, Differing Visions, Dissenters in Mormon History, from the University of Illinois Press, 1994, and with Patricia Lynn Scott, Women in Utah History, Paradigm or Paradox, from Logan, Utah State University Press from 2005. She is featured on a KBYU documentary in 2018 entitled Utah's Famous Firsts, in which she discusses Lester Wire, the inventor of the traffic light. She is also a lifetime member of the Utah State Historical Society. We also have Kenneth L on the end. He is an independent historian, and his title today is Stories, Art, and Mysteries of the Salt Lake City Cemetery. Ken is an independent historian and an attorney in private practice at a local law firm. Ken has published widely on late 19th century and early 20th century Utah and Mormon history. He is fascinated by the stories and the art and the mysteries of the Salt Lake City Cemetery and other historic cemeteries in the city, and has conducted an annual tour of the city cemetery each October for the Alta Club. Finally, we conclude with Jeffery Ogden Johnson. He is a fellow with the Utah State Historical Society, and his program today is titled Remembering the Forgotten. He is retired from the LDS Church Historical Department, and earlier he served as director of the Utah State Archives and as an archivist at the Cherokee National History Society. He is a fellow of the Utah State Historical Society, and he also gives tours of Salt Lake City Cemetery. So with that, we are going to start with Linda.
Well, thank you for coming today, and I would especially like to thank my family and friends
I don't think it's on.
Oh.
Where is it? There you go.
My family and friends who made an extra effort to be here today. I really appreciate that. Well, why discuss cemeteries in conjunction with the theme of our conference, Long View of History? Well, of course, cemeteries have had a long history, but their history continues to change with changing values concerning death and the increase in property. Cemeteries are actually evolving fairly fast. So today I'm going to discuss a brief history of burials in the United States, which is very brief. And then I'm going to talk about the characteristics of the different cemeteries used in the United States and the philosophy behind them. And then if I have time, I'll talk a little bit about the number of cemeteries in Utah and who owns or manages them. The first burials in the United States took place in Jamestown, Virginia. It was settled in 1607 in the spring, and by summer, 104 of there were 104 people, and 38 remained alive. They buried them at night, usually within their compound. And the reason they did this was the surrounding Indian tribes were still unknown to them, and they didn't want them to know how few people were left living in the compound. In the West, the colonial Spanish cemeteries followed the ancient Christian burial traditions. Graves faced east toward the rising sun. They had headstones as well as walls around the cemetery. The Catholic Church in Taos Pueblo was built in 1619 and destroyed in 1947. And this is the earliest type of Christian burial in the United States. Well, moving on to the Mormons, which is a big jump, but the Mormon pioneers had their own trials. According to Melvin Bay Shore and Dennis Tolley's article, Mortality on the Mormon Trail, published by BYU Studies, 1,910 people died on the trail from to Utah. And this doesn't count the thousands who died on the Oregon and Santa Fe Trail. The trails were known as the longest graveyards. By the time they reached Salt Lake City, they were very well acquainted with death. During the early days of settlement and building in the forbidding environment, the first things that they had to deal with were nourishment, religion, and education. And this is according to a study that was done of the Box Elder and Summit County cemeteries by Geddes and Fredrickson. And they said the dead would have to return to nature on nature's terms. Under such conditions, early cemeteries, folkways had the origin in Utah. Well, what kind of cemeteries are there? And this is mainly what I'm talking about today. According to all the literature I've read and everything, there are classifications of cemeteries. And as the pioneers settled, they did not necessarily follow the traditions they knew. And I think they knew, the burial traditions. A lot of the people were from the East, or they had immigrated from Europe, and they were most likely very familiar with how people were buried there. The most common type of burial were church graveyards, such as in the Trinity Church on Wall Street in New York. It was established in 1696 and was the resting place for a large portion of New York's English Protestant population. By the 1800s, it contained over 100,000 burials. And it was, I'll talk about this a little bit later, but anyway, it was a real issue. Church burials were the primary burials in Europe. But for some reason, this type of burial has never particularly used in Utah. The only ones that I'm aware of was that Lawrence Scanlon, who was buried in the Cathedral of the Madeleine in 1915. And there's a columbarium in St. Mark's Cathedral downtown, which is the Episcopal Church. and it contains niches where cremains are placed. The next type of burial plot that was fairly common is the family burial plot. And the family burial plots are unique to North America. Europeans did not use them. Sometimes nobility would, because they were rich, they would establish their own burial grounds. In the United States, they are most common in isolated areas. In Texas, they have over like 50,000 burial grounds. They're very common. In fact, in Texas, you can still set up your own family burial ground today. Well, in Utah, there's only a couple that I really know of, and of course there's the Brigham Young Family Cemetery, which is located on First Avenue, and it's a beautiful little spot. Another one is the Kimball Whitney Family Cemetery, which is located between Main and State Street, and it's about a half block from North Temple. And if you want to have a delightful day, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has set up a park there. It's sort of an interior block park, which is just absolutely beautiful. They don't have tables, but if you take a chair, it'd be a nice place to have your lunch. Another one is the Huffaker Family Cemetery, located in the south part of the valley. Another distinctive type of cemetery is the country cemetery. And they can often be seen from the car window as you drive down the road. They're usually distinguished by a grove of pine trees and are located on higher ground. According to Geddes and Carmen in their cemeteries of Box Elder and Summit County, the borders of the burial area were usually a half mile to 3 miles out of town to accommodate the limits of horse travel within a reasonable time. At one time in Utah, most of these cemeteries were owned by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but they've since been turned over to the city and county governments. Another very distinctive type of cemetery is the garden cemetery. And this grew out of the overpopulation of cemeteries in the larger cities. And as Americans' attitude toward death changed from the grim reality of death toward finding beauty in death, cemeteries began to take on a more pleasant look. The garden-type cemetery replaced the graveyard and the churchyard. The first was Mount Auburn Cemetery in 1831, which is outside of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Before there were public parks, this was where people went on Sunday afternoons to picnic, contemplate, and take strolls. By the mid-1800s, 10 major cities had garden cemeteries. People were encouraged to purchase family plots and to visit the cemeteries on weekends. They were a destination. The cemeteries were the first large open spaces or green spaces, and they were the beginning of city parks. In Salt Lake, the only one I could really find with the name of garden was Elysian Gardens, which is actually a lovely little cemetery hidden up on 4600 South and about 10th East. It's hidden right in the middle of the block, and it's completely surrounded by houses. But it's not a true garden cemetery because it doesn't have the garden cemetery features. Liberty Park is most likely an outgrowth of the garden movement. And so from garden cemeteries it went to parks after that. Another important cemetery that we've all seen is the urban cemeteries. And these cemeteries might look like stone yards with rows and rows of tombstones, straight paths, and little foliage. They too can be fairly large, requiring one to visit the office to find grave locations. Urban cemeteries are usually public cemeteries and are run by the city or counties. This is a photo of the Logan Cemetery, which is located on the east side of town. And it was established in 1882, but it was moved from its original site west of Utah State University. And of course, there's Salt Lake City Cemetery that was established in 1851, and it's the largest municipal cemetery in the United States. Another genre of cemeteries is the veterans and military cemeteries. And these are, a veterans cemetery is specifically for honorably discharged servicemen and their families. There are 139 in the United States. Utah was one of 4 states that did not have a veterans cemetery, and the ground was finally broken in June of 1988 and dedicated on Memorial Day in 1990. These cemeteries are distinguished by the use of standardized monuments. Fort Douglas is a post cemetery that opened in 1862. A memorial park or lawn park cemetery is also very distinctive. And these are flat, grassy lawn with barely any visible evidence that people are buried there. And that is their purpose, to eliminate suggestions of death. There are no grave mounds, headstones are flat and flush with the ground, and for more easy mowing. The first of this kind was established in the early 1900s in Southern California, and today is known as Forest Lawn. The goal is to give the cemetery a more park-like landscape, and I know if you drive up 33rd South, you look into Wasatch Lawn, it just looks more like a large green space than a cemetery. And standardized headstones are eliminating social distinction, and that was part of why they were set up. Wasatch Lawn opened in 1912 by Stephen L. Richards. He envisioned a place where serenity and peace of nature enshrine the tender memories that of loved ones. Okay. The next one is a potter's field, or that sometimes they called it a stranger's cemetery, because people passing through a community sometimes passed away. They didn't know who they were, so they would just go ahead and bury them. And this is where the county or city buries the poor, the unknown, and unwanted. Sometimes there are mass graves. Individual graves are seldom marked. And the one in Salt Lake is just a large grassy area, and if you came up to it, you'd probably think that no one was buried there, but it's probably totally filled. Joseph A. Slade is one of the most popular figures buried in the cemetery, and his grave is, I think, is visited a lot. Well, as time has progressed, today the newest type of cemetery is called the natural or green cemetery. And it looks to me, I haven't visited it yet, but there actually is one in Utah. And the philosophy behind the green cemetery is that in a normal cemetery, they use toxic fertilizers and pesticides, and they don't use those in a green cemetery. And everything just sort of returns to nature there. Nor do they use headstones or they may mark the graves with GPS. That may be how they find them. Okay, and now we get to my favorite, and these are all my favorite stories right here. And I have some good stories for this one. But the Hyde Park Pet Cemetery in London operated from 1881 to 1903 by a gatekeeper at Victoria Lodge and has around 300 burials. And this is apparently hidden in the park. It's not open to the public. But I guess the locals know it's there. In most states, pets cannot be buried with people, and so cemeteries exclusively for pets evolved. Hartsdale, New York Pet Cemetery and Crematorium was the first in the U.S. Established by veterinarian Samuel Johnson on his apple orchard in 1896, it is the final resting place of nearly 70,000 pets. These are a couple of others. I haven't visited this one, but I understand it's very nice. And Angels Rest, of course, that Best Friends Sanctuary is very popular. Well, in the past, Salt Lake County had 2 pet cemeteries that are now defunct. One was operated by Mel Humphreys on 3600 West, and it operated from 1956 to 1977. The Humane Society also operated a cemetery called Green Pastures between 1966 and 1989 on 400 West. Well, today these are commercial property. They're no longer cemeteries. And so after discovering this, I thought, well, I'm going to go up to the Cottonwood Canyons Pet Memorial Garden and see if it really exists. And it does. And it opened in 2009 and is approximately on 7800 South and 3115 East. And I'll cry because I have all my little pets. Anyway, it's a beautiful cemetery. And this is where the Salt Lake City police dogs are interred. But anyway, I suggest if you just have a Saturday afternoon or Sunday afternoon, drive up there and look at it. It's just beautiful. Well, how many cemeteries are there in Utah? According to the Utah Funeral Directors Directory, there are around 300. And who owns these cemeteries? Well, they're owned by a lot of people, and cities, counties, churches, synagogues, Veterans Affairs, private individuals, large companies, and even school districts manage the cemeteries. The Bingham Cemetery is managed by the local school district. And I don't know if you can believe this or not, but on Facebook last week I read where a man bought a cemetery in Florida for $9,000 it was advertised on Craigslist. So anyway, the cemeteries are they're vulnerable for a lot of reasons, and the one is that there is a lot of changing attitudes towards death and burial and how it's handled. Another reason is that cemeteries, particularly in cities, are taking prime land, and even though there are laws that govern them, developers seem to win in Salt Lake, as far as I can see. So anyway, I think that cemeteries are changing very, very quickly, and will change even more in the future. Thank you.
Good afternoon. The Salt Lake Cemetery, like all great cemeteries, is an accumulation of many things: history and family and memories and art and green space. Uh-oh. It's not working. Maybe because I'm trying to go backwards. The city cemetery is probably most known as the final resting place of prominent Mormon leaders, but it is much, much more than that. It is full of stories and characters and mysteries. I can only begin to describe some of the interesting aspects of the city cemetery, history and culture, and the wonderful mysteries of the cemetery. Most of the great headstones in the cemetery, in my view, were made by Elias Morris and Sons from about 1870 to 1930, and his workers were masters at fashioning stone into beautiful pieces of art. He also did, do I have this upside down again? No? He also did stonework for houses and other buildings. Morris's own family plot is lovely. One of my favorite details of the cemetery is 7 statues of mourning women. I believe almost all of these were at least sold by Elias Morris, and some or all may have also been sculpted there. Here's Francis Armstrong's monument in the cemetery, and here it is on Elias Morris's pop-up store on South Temple and Main Street in the early 1890s. Same statue, same headstone. 7 is a magical number, like the 7 virtues, and it seems appropriate that the Salt Lake City Cemetery has 7 historic statues like these. 5 of the statues cover the graves of prominent and generally prosperous Mormon men and their wives. Some of these monuments are surrounded by sadness. Francis Armstrong and his 2 wives, Isabella Sidaway and Sarah Caruth, lost 6 of their 16 children in the first 2 years of the children's lives. The Morris' oldest child, like the Armstrongs, George and Martha Morris, suffered extraordinary loss in their family. Their first child, Sarah, lived to be 20. 1 or 2 of the next 8 lived to be 3 or 4. All of them died long before their parents died, and they had 9 children who were born alive, lived to be toddlers, and had died without descendants. Joseph Smith, a common Mormon name apparently, and his wife Eliza Bean is perhaps the most elaborate of the 7 statues. Martin and Christine Brixen were Danish converts of the LDS Church who did well in their new homeland. John and Eleanor MacDonald's statue is the only one of the 7 not looking at the ground, and you wonder why. The final 2 statues are more mysterious. One is the statue to Dorcas Halford Hokinson, who passed away in 1911. I haven't found much about her yet. The image of her face in bas-relief carved in the headstone is really quite haunting. The 7th and final statue is one of the great mysteries of the cemetery. Ralph D. Quinn was from Lima, Ohio, and came to Salt Lake City in the early 1900s to work as a brakeman on the railroad. Had a serious drinking problem and ended up working as a barkeeper in several saloons around 2nd South and Main. He also lived in seedy hotels in the same area. Eventually, he married Audrey Hill in 1921, who was probably a prostitute. In 1923, Ralph Quinn died of syphilis at the age of 45, and a lovely monument was placed over his grave. The statue is missing an arm, which may have happened before it was placed. How can an alcoholic, likely married to a prostitute who worked as a bartender, lived in a cheap hotel, and died of syphilis, come to have one of the loveliest, most expensive headstones in Salt Lake City Cemetery? It's a captivating mystery. I hope to find out one day, and I suspect it will be an enlightening story. One of the favorite art forms in the monuments are the obelisks. Some are large, most are smaller. The LDS family erected a large obelisk to Hiram Smith many years ago. His descendants are buried nearby. Other obelisks are to Mormon Church presidents John Taylor and Heber J. Grant, with grants made from lovely Vermont marble. I'll focus on 3 of these obelisks. The first is James McTurnay's obelisk at the top of the Celtic cross circle in the Mount Calvary Catholic Cemetery, which is part of it's adjacent to at least the Salt Lake City Cemetery. McTurnay was the owner of a popular tavern at 32 West, 2nd South in the early 20th century called the Onyx Bank. He apparently had a very happy clientele. When he died unexpectedly in 1910, his patrons decided that he would have the largest obelisk in the extended cemetery, larger than Mormon prophets and everyone else. They pooled their money and bought the impressive obelisk, creating a fun mystery in the Catholic cemetery about who this guy was. The most elegant obelisk in the cemetery is that of Anthony H. Lund. I skipped ahead. A longtime member of the LDS Church's Quorum 12 Apostles and First Presidency, who died in 1921. The obelisk is formed from Vermont marble. He was Danish and was the first non-native English speaker to serve in the First Presidency of the Church. The other one, of course, is Dieter Uchtdorf, who's alive today. Anthony Lund is also different from his brethren because he was the only senior leader in the church in the 1880s and 90s who was not a polygamist. He always said that his wife, Sarah Peterson Lund, told him that she would leave him if he married another, and apparently he didn't want that to happen. This obelisk is extraordinary. It is so, I showed it to Brad West when he said that is early 20th century Nordic classicism. I mean, it's spare, it's not highly decorated, it was probably polished to
Which one is the of the two over here?
He's the guy over on the right. So it's perfectly appropriate. He's Danish and he has a Danish obelisk in the cemetery. The third obelisk is the one over Orrin Porter Rockwell's grave. There he is. Rockwell was a frontiersman and marshal, fiercely loyal to the Mormon Church and its leaders. He reportedly killed many men. On Christmas 1843, Joseph Smith, quote, blessed Rockwell, stating that he would not be harmed by, quote, bullet or blade as long as he stayed faithful to the faith and did not cut his hair. In 1966, however, I've always read this, I finally found these pictures. He did cut his hair upon learning that Agnes Goldbridge Smith Pickett, the widow of Joseph Smith's younger brother, John Carlos Smith, and also a widow of Joseph Smith, had lost her hair from typhoid fever. Rockwell cut his locks so they could be fashioned into a wig for Agnes. He likely did this from his love of Joseph Smith. He then grew his hair back and died from natural causes in 1878 while awaiting trial on long-standing murder charges. Other interesting markers. You have Anthony Ivan's petrified log, Hiram B. Clausen's granite. He managed the Salt Lake Theater, a large stone piece, and John M. Bernheisel, who was a University of Pennsylvania trained physician and early Utah political leader, with this. And I know the stone, but I can't remember what it's called. So what else is there in the cemetery? There are different ethnic and faith community sections in the cemetery. It has a number of different sections. The largest are Mount Calvary Catholic Cemetery and the two historic Jewish cemeteries, Congregation Montefiore and B'nai Israel cemeteries. But there are several others, including a Chinese plat and a Japanese section. In the Bishop Lawrence Scanlon negotiated the purchase of 19 acres on the eastern edge of the Salt Lake Cemetery for $1 from Salt Lake City, and on September 17, 1897, Mayor James Glendenning transferred the property to the diocese. Mount Calvary Catholic Cemetery was laid out around a Celtic cross and has been the place for Salt Lake Catholics to be buried ever since. Most of the prominent Catholic families are buried here: Kearnses and Judges, Cosgers and Iverses, and many others. Many of the nuns and priests who died in the city are buried in the inner circle of the Celtic cross. I already mentioned James McTurney's obelisk, which is there. A pleasant surprise is the grave of William Tournier. And an Oreo cookie is imprinted on Tournier's headstone right here. Did this man just like Oreos? Or is there something more important going on here? Well, there is. He was the senior graphic designer for Nabisco Foods. He created this. This is the most iconic graphic image in the world, and he created it. And it is so appropriate that it is on his grave. He also, billions of Oreos are imprinted with his design. He also designed the Nutter Butter, Lorna Doone, Ritz Cameo, Animal Crackers, and Milkbone. He and his wife moved here from New Jersey when he retired to be near a daughter, and we have this lovely grave in the Mount Calvary Cemetery. Enid Cosgriff was a generous patron of the arts in Salt Lake, while her husband Walter was a prominent banker and businessman. Enid took over much of Walter's business positions when he died in a car accident in 1961. She had important contributions, such as creating the cultural institutions as the precursor to Ballet West, paying for much of the renovation and preservation of such buildings as Holy Cross Hospital and the Cathedral of Magdalene. And she was also contributed significantly Utah Symphony, Utah Shakespearean Festival, and University Hospital. Even more interesting, at least to me, is that she and her husband had owned a majority interest in the Salt Lake Bees. And when he died, she made herself the general manager and president of the Salt Lake Bees, becoming the first woman in the United States to hold those positions in a professional baseball organization. And even better, as a Cubs fan, in 1963 she created the first MLB affiliation for a Salt Lake City team when she negotiated an affiliation with the Chicago Cubs. So, good stuff. What about the historic Jewish cemeteries? The tradition is that Brigham Young donated the land for a Jewish cemetery in the Salt Lake Cemetery in 1869 at the request of Fanny Brooks, prominent businesswoman and milliner in early Salt Lake City. I believe that the portion of the cemetery donated was where now B'nai Israel is, at the south end of the city cemetery between Q and R streets. The B'nai Israel congregation, whose original lovely synagogue still stands, though it's not used as a synagogue anymore, was originally a conservative congregation but changed more into a reform group in the 1880s. At that time, the more conservative members of the synagogue left and formed the congregation Montefiore, whose original synagogue also still stands, again not used anymore as a synagogue. The differences between the two cemeteries, between the two groups, manifest themselves in the cemeteries. Most headstones in the Montefiore Cemetery are inscribed with this, which is an abbreviation of a verse in the first book of Samuel 25:29, quote, "May his soul be bound up in the bond of eternal life," end quote, which seems like a perfectly appropriate thing to put on a grave. Most of the markers in the B'nai Israel Cemetery do not have this inscription. The first generation of some of Salt Lake's most prominent Jewish families, such as the Rosenblatts and Wagners, are buried in the Montefiore Cemetery, while later generations are buried in B'nai Israel. For example, the prosperous Rosenblatt family, two Rosenblatt brothers, these are their vaults. And the old, I thought I had a picture of the makeups. There's a gracious, there's an elegant mausoleum to the Makoff family. You remember the old women's store on South Temple. Simon Bamberger, the second Jewish governor in the U.S., who was elected in the Democratic Progressive landslide of 1916. Can't believe that there was such a thing in Utah, but there was. And his wife, Ida Bamberger, Jewish businesswoman Fanny Brooks, who with her husband Julius built the Brooks Arcade on the corner of State and Broadway, and brothers Frederick and Samuel Auerbach, are prominent in the B'nai Israel Cemetery. Auerbach's was a wonderful department store on State and Broadway for decades. Samuel was married to Eveline Brooks, Fanny and Julius Brooks' daughter. Samuel and Eveline's son Herbert Auerbach is a fascinating character in city history. Herbert studied violin in Switzerland, received a master's degree in metallurgy from Columbia, and then eventually moved back to do what? To run the family business. He was, like many Jews in the city, Herbert maintained friendly relations with the Mormon leaders. Herbert even served for a time as the general president of the Sons of Utah Pioneers. Both of his parents were, in fact, Utah pioneers, and so why not? So then I'm going to skip the Morris because I don't have time. The Chinese Plat. So Salt Lake City had a robust, though small, Chinatown in early 20th century. The Chinese communities settled along Plum Alley, which I won't show you because I don't have it there, which is the alley between 1st and 2nd South and Main and State Streets, and ran parallel to Regent Street, which used to be called Commercial Street. This whole area has had a nice resurgence. A detailed downtown map of Salt Lake in 1898 showed that the enterprising Chinese community also had a vegetable garden covering about a quarter of a downtown block near Plum Alley. There's a plaque about Commercial Street in the sidewalk along Regent Street now, remembering its history. The Chinese Plat dates from 1918 and is the burial site of many of Salt Lake's Chinese community. Some of the people buried there were born in the 1860s. The completion of the Central Pacific portion of the Transcontinental Railroad, which was what brought the first Chinese to Salt Lake in Utah. They were very skilled at engineering and completing railroad lines, and were particularly skilled in using explosives to make clear passages through mountains and tunnels along the way. That's a very rare burner. If I had more time, I'd explain what is done there. There are very few of those left in the United States from that period. I'm going to skip another section and get to some of my favorites. So there was a woman named Lavinia Hawkins Hyde Woodmansee, who was the main defendant in one of the most important divorce trials in Anglo-American legal history. heard in 1886 under England's new divorce law by Sir James O. Wilde, who later became prominent as Lord Penzance. The backstory is wonderful. Lavinia came to America as a Mormon convert and married her long-term beau, John Hyde Jr., with Brigham Young performing the marriage. Brother Hyde's faith waned and he planned to move to California. Brigham Young called him on a mission to the Sandwich Islands. Elder Hyde went reluctantly and on his way, quote, in communion with God and my own soul, the darkness of doubt that had blinded my eyes, it left me and I resolved to renounce Mormonism and to fight against it. He eventually wrote an important early anti-Mormon book called Mormonism, Its Leaders and Designs. He begged Lavinia to join him, but she loved the church more than she loved him and remained in Utah. From the pulpit of the old tabernacle, Mormon leader Heber C. Kimball, quote, cut Hyde off root and branch from the church and, quote, delivered him over to Satan to be buffeted in the flesh. Kimball also effected a quickie divorce from the pulpit, stating that Lavinia was, quote, not cut off from the church, but she is free from Hyde. The limb she was connected to is cut off. She must again be grafted into the tree if she wishes to be saved. 2 years later, she married Joseph Woodmansee as a polygamous wife. Hyde moved back to England, and in 1896 he decided to seek a divorce from Lavinia, taking advantage of the new Divorce Act. Hyde told the judge the sad story of his marriage. The future Lord of Penzance ruled that because the marriage occurred in Utah, where he understood polygamy was legal, the marriage was, quote, potentially polygamous, end quote. The court then defined a marriage as the union of one man and one woman for life, which is still the definition in the Anglo-American civil law tradition based on this case. Because a potentially polygamous marriage violated this definition, John and Lavinia's marriage was not recognized for purposes of the Divorce Act. Hyde versus Hyde and Woodmansee was cited hundreds, if not thousands of times in subsequent cases in common law courts. Oh, there's their grave, little obelisk. And there's much too writing to try to read. The next person is Martha Hughes Cannon. Maddie, as she was called by friends and family, was a polygamous wife of my father's grandfather, Angus M. Cannon. Maddie received her medical degree from the University of Michigan and was an early feminist and first woman state senator elected in the United States. In 1896, the year of Utah's admission to the Union, she and her husband Angus ran in the same election. She is a Democrat, he is a Republican. She was elected, he was not. She described the state of plural wives to a San Francisco Chronicle reporter in 1896, shortly after she was elected as state senator, quote, if her husband has 4 wives, a Mormon woman has 3 weeks of freedom per month, end quote. A statue of Maddie will soon grace the halls of the United States Capitol as one of Utah's 2 representatives, displacing my wife's relative Philo T. Farnsworth, the inventor of the television family smackdown between us. Brockbank City baby graves between 1861 and 1867. Isaac and Catherine Brockbank lost 5 babies, 2 of them a pair of twins. They're buried under these 4 graves. My another great-great-grandfather, Charles Lambert, as most of the sandstone headstones in Salt Lake, carved them. They're all deteriorating. His headstone, of course, is made of granite. William Jennings was the most prominent of early Salt Lake City merchants and reputed to be Utah's first millionaire. He was LDS and a polygamist. His 2 wives, Jane Walker and Priscilla Paul, each had at one time or another a lovely sound. So this is a really unusual picture. You do not see polygamous families, polygamous wives pictured together. Okay. They each had a mansion on South Temple. Different kind of polygamy. Isaac Russell, one of my favorite characters in the cemetery, as his friends called him, Ike, was an unbelievable journalist. He worked for the New York Times. He ghost wrote the first-person account of the sinking of the Titanic, and the story of that is wonderful. He was the first aviation editor of the New York Times. Knew Glenn Curtis and the Wright brothers very well. The Charles Wilkin is a guy I wish I had time to talk about. Louis Wells, my very favorite headstone in the grave, was the most extraordinary young woman in 1880s Salt Lake City. She was everything. She was star of the Salt Lake Theater. She was an accomplished artist. She had a beautiful mezzo-soprano voice. She sang in the Tabernacle Choir from age 15 on. She was General Secretary of the Young Ladies MIA for the entire church when she was 18 years old. She was involved with an unbelievable scandal with a guy named John Q. Cannon, who was George Q. Cannon's oldest son. It's a fascinating story that I have told before that I called it tragic, and it is. This is what her grave looks like. There she is in the Mikado. Here she is with 19 other women, all of whom are at least 20 years older than she is, representing art. Here she is as the first General Secretary. Here's John Q. Cannon, handsome guy. Here's the fathers of the two, who are both prominent LDS leaders. And there is her grave, a lonely little grave that only says Louis, because everyone in Salt Lake City knew who Louis was. There was nothing else you needed to put on her grave. She had a complicated last name. She was married briefly to John Q. Cannon, her sister's husband. And it's anyway, it's a great story. As I tell my wife, whenever I walk into the cemetery, my first reaction is, so many stories, so little time. It's a great place to find fun stories. Thank you.
I have to admit that I have a reason to talk to you. I want all of you on my side and to ask the Salt Lake City Cemetery to revise one of their policies. This policy is that the graves can only be taken care of, repaired, if you're a descendant of the person there. And there are people in the cemetery who have no descendants. And so what I want to do is to introduce to you 4 grave sites that this policy damages. I first need to tell you that I was introduced to this policy by Mark Smith, the former sexton who died a little while ago. But all the staff repeated this policy to me. I've talked to a city council member about getting the policy changed. I've asked if they could give me a print of the policy, and I haven't been able to get that. I've also asked for an appointment at the acting sexton. Haven't been able to get that. So this is my complaint, and I'd like all of you to get on my side. I became aware of this policy by getting to know Edward Sayers, who is buried right here. And as you notice, he doesn't have a headstone. In 1996, a few of us as neighbors of the city cemetery decided to do a survey. We looked at the first 100 burials and we found that only a third of them had headstones. I think the reason is because many of them originally had headstones, whether they were wood or sandstone, had disappeared. Well, Edward Sayers is one of the people whose headstone disappeared. I want to tell you a little bit about him because I think it's important that he get a headstone. He was born in Canterbury, England. His father was the head gardener on an estate in that area. Edward grew up gardening, and by 1837 he was living in the United States, in Boston, working as a professional landscape gardener. In the United States, he published several important books concerning gardening, and I'd like to repeat these to you. A manual on the culture of grapes, a treatise on the culture of the dahlia. This is a pamphlet that was about one flower. Probably the first in the United States that such a thing happen. He also published American Fruit Gardener's Companion and the American Flower Gardener's Companion, which was really considered an important book at the time. In January of 1841, Sayers married a Mormon woman named Ruth Voice in St. Louis, Missouri. They were on their way to the Mormon settlement of Nauvoo. Edward never adopted the religion of his wife, but his life was controlled by his association with the Mormon Church. He, in Nauvoo, he had a 10-acre farm. This is one of the places that Joseph Smith hid from the mob. And when Joseph Smith was killed and the Mormons moved west, Edward Sayers and his wife Ruth moved with them. He had a lot here in Salt Lake, and he had plants and sold seeds from this lot. It was very important because we were in a desert here, and he was one who stimulated the planting of plants that are appropriate and to developing both vegetable gardens and flower gardens. He sold vegetables and flowers and seeds from his own yard. The people in the Intermountain West read his advice on plants and seeds in the newspaper. The parade for the 4th of July in 1861, he directed the horticulture displays on wagons loaded with fruit and vegetables. But a few days later, he died at the age of 59. His funeral was held on July 18th. The parade, of course, was on July 4th, and he was buried here in the cemetery. Esther Truett Henrichson, the landscape designer at Thanksgiving Point, has researched Sayers' influence on the American horticulture. She's spoken at garden club meetings and raised interest in getting him a headstone. We talked to the sexton about getting that done, and he said, no, we couldn't. We're not descendants of Sayers. Sayers never fathered a child, which means he has no descendants. When I talked to the staff at the cemetery, they said, well, he probably has brothers and sisters. And I said, you know, he was born in England. He left England 170 years ago. I assume his brothers and sisters' descendants have no interest in his cemetery, his grave here. So this made me interested in finding out the graves of other people who have no descendants. So I'm going to introduce 3 more people with you. And I think I tell you about their life so you understand why I think we need to remember them. This is, to me, the jewel of the cemetery. It's a beautiful sandstone headstone that was carved when the granite and the other stone was not available, or very available. The sandstone was cheaper. It was carved is beautifully carved. And this is a headstone that I'd very much like to preserve. Tells us about what many of the headstones were in the cemetery. You can see, though, the problem with these headstones. This is a grass mowing machine's damage on the bottom of it. One of the biggest problems with the cemetery is that we insist on having grass. So we have to have the grass mowed. I give tours several a year, and I've seen headstones knocked over by the lawnmowers. Also, we spray these headstones with water to preserve the grass, and you can see what the water does, sprayed 2 or 3 times a week on this particular headstone. Julia de Salle, whose headstone this is, was born in Switzerland. She and her husband came to Utah. They left their only child in Switzerland who had died. So she has no descendants here to worry about this headstone. So I've decided to worry about it myself. The next one is the headstone of John R. Park. Every time I say his name, people say, "Oh, the Park building on the University of Utah campus." There's a statue of him there. He was the person that I think created the university. He was hired to have educational department training school teachers for Utah, but he felt like the university should have a broader path than that. So he's the one that added university classes and had hired scholars. You can see that his headstone has been damaged. This is the way it should be. It should have a round ball on the top. This is a picture of him. I needed to tell you a story about, because we're thinking about if he had children, about a wife. He was a bachelor. He felt most of his life, and when he died, he gave his estate to the University of Utah. And a woman by the name of Annie Hilton sued to get her widow's share. She had been the daughter of the Utah painter William Armistead, and 19 years old. They had met Park, and she got very ill and she was going to die. And so the Mormon apostle Daniel H. Wells said to Park, "You should marry her. She's going to die. You won't have to live as man and wife, and yet you'll fulfill the Mormon doctrine that you need to be married in the hereafter." So the people who were there said that Park said to the doctor, "Are you sure she's dying?" And the doctor said yes. So Daniel H. Wells sealed them, as a couple, but she got better. So Park asked Brigham Young to cancel the sealing. It was a church sealing, and so Brigham Young canceled it. And Park always said that it wasn't a marriage. But after his death, Annie decided that she should get some of his estate. She had married soon after the divorce, and married a man by the name of William Hilton, and had 11 children by him. But the courts said that while Mormon clergy can marry people, Brigham Young had no right to give them a divorce. So the University of Utah just got 2/3 of his estate, and Annie and her husband and 11 children got the other third. I was going to show you a picture of Vienna Jax's headstone, and I spent a lot of time looking for it, and it's part of the problem. I've seen it before, and if you go on the internet you can see it, but it's very small. It's about this big. And I decided the day we were there, the grass had grown over the top. If you can see it on the internet, you'll know that that her birth date is wrong on it, and I believe we need to get a bigger headstone for her that people can find. There are 2 women mentioned in Mormon scripture, and Joseph Smith's wife Emma is one, and she's the other one. She was very involved in the early church. She came to Utah. She lived a life where she took care of ill and sick people for her job, for her living, and I just wanted to read about her life here in Salt Lake. The Women's Exponent report that when she was 91 years old, she made 61 pounds of butter and was milking her own cow. Another time they reported that she lives entirely alone, never having had a family, does all her own housework, including washing, ironing, and cooking. She writes many letters and does a great deal of reading. Well, she died at the age of 96, and she's buried here. Has no descendants. So I think that we who should honor her and repair her headstone. It's actually one that was done in the 20th century. I think that's the reason they got her birth year wrong. They couldn't believe that she was 96 years old when she died. So anyway, there is something that makes me have more courage that we can get this rule changed. The cemetery recently put this headstone up. Tom was an enslaved man here in Utah who's buried here in Potter's Field that was shown, and this is a headstone that just recently has been put up. Of course, I went to the staff and says, "Did you talk to his descendants?" And their answer was, "Well, we can do what we want." Anyway, I'm dedicated to trying to get this rule changed. I think more and more people are dying who have no descendants, and I think this policy It really should be changed. Thank you.
Alright. So, as you have obviously, where'd the mouse go? Learned there are so many stories in our cemeteries, and there's a part of every cemetery that will speak to each and every one of you. Different stories become meaningful to different people. And so I'm really glad we were able to talk about this today. We're going to have about 20 minutes for a question and answer. And I'm going to try to figure out how to get that off. It is off. So we'll just do a question and answer. We can pass around the microphone for our three panelists. I'll call on anybody who raises their hand, and you can direct it to whomever you wish to have your question answered. Anybody to start? Yes.
Let's see. Pet cemeteries. There's a Lookout Pass Pet Cemetery in Douglas, Utah, and also one in Rush Valley, both along the Pony Express route.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I need to respond.
Okay.
Just to I didn't know about that.
Yes, in the back there.
I was wondering, Ms. Thatcher, if you could talk more about that one cemetery owned by the school district. I've never heard of that. Do you know more about that? How they...
It's my understanding that the Bingham Cemetery is administered by the local school district, and I think you probably know this better than I think there's another one too that is it's sort of expedient, there isn't always someone available to take care of a cemetery, and so I think that there are two cemeteries around here that are administered by the school district. There may be more.
Yes.
Jeff, I'm wondering about Sayers' wife and where she's buried, and then she was married to Joseph Smith. So, if you did her headstone, how would you handle her name?
She has a headstone. Her headstone is old, but it's in nice condition. It is not in the same place as where Edward was buried, and that kind of destroyed Esther when Esther said, "Oh, Edward loved Ruth so much that he followed her to Utah." I don't know why they weren't buried near each other. He died a lot earlier than her. She was a widow for many years, but her headstone is nice.
Okay. Yes, please.
Question for Ken.
Yeah.
Quick preface. You skipped by several stories. You said
Right.
if I had more time. So my question is, which story, now that you have a little more time in the form of this question, would you like to share with me?
Wow. That is like choosing between my 5 sons. Maybe Charles Wilkin. So Charles Wilkin was a guy. He was a Prussian. He received the Iron Cross for service in the Prussian Army in the 1840s. He immigrated to the United States because he knew after he won the Iron Cross, the Prince of Prussia, sounds like a video game, wanted him to be his personal bodyguard. He was 6'4" in the 1840s. He came to the United States with his brother, couldn't find a job, joined the U.S. Army, came west with Johnston's army, didn't like U.S. Army discipline, shockingly enough for a Prussian, sort of skipped and went and lived with a family in Salt Lake City. He joined the LDS Church and became not the Prince of Persia's bodyguard, but LDS President's Prophet's bodyguard. But that's only the beginning. Interestingly, he won the Iron Cross. His headstone says, Captain in the Black Hawk War. Okay, well, yeah, they're kind of equivalent, aren't they? He was an intimate, he was not really just a bodyguard. For my ancestor, George Buchanan, he and Charles Wilkin were intimates. He was always in his pictures. He was an advisor to him. One of his daughters married one of George Q's sons. one of the most interesting, there's a lynching that scares me to death in 1883 in Salt Lake City. There was an African-American Civil War veteran named Joe Sam Harvey who robbed a store a few doors down from the police department on First South and State Street. Andrew Burt, who was the city marshal, and his friend Charles Wilkin, who was just kind of hanging out with him there, went down to find this guy, arrest him. Joe Sam Harvey shot both of them. He killed Andrew Burt, and he wounded Charles Wilkin. The entire Downtown Alliance, 2,000 people is the report, which I don't believe. All the businessmen and lawyers and staffers in downtown Salt Lake City went and grabbed this guy, hanged him from this black guy, hanged him from the rafters of a nearby warehouse. This is in 1883. When he died, they dragged him through the streets of Salt Lake City. They then took him up and dumped his body on the edge of Potter's Field in Salt Lake Cemetery. Well, Charles Wilkin at the same time was being attended for a wound to his arm. I believe in my heart of hearts that Charles Wilkin probably could have prevented that lynching because he just had that force of nature. He would have said, people, this is not the right thing. Stop it. He can be taken care of in the courts. And you know, interesting. So handsome big man. His most famous descendants are George Wilkin Romney, who's Mitt Romney's father, and Mitt Romney. I mean, that's where the Romneys get their handsome looks. I mean, Charles Wilkin was a really interesting guy, one of the most interesting characters in Salt Lake City history. How's that?
Yes, I've noticed, in other places besides the Salt Lake City Cemetery that Mormons and non-Mormons are buried in separate areas. And is this more of a cultural thing, or was there such animosity between the two groups they're afraid they would go to the wrong heaven if they were?
I think it's a unique thing to hear. The Salt Lake City Cemetery is a city cemetery. So no matter what religion you are, you could be buried there. The Mormons dedicate just the gravesite. Often other religions, for example, the Catholic Church and Mount Calvary, they dedicate the whole cemetery. So they can control who's buried in that cemetery. But the Mormon tradition is just dedicating each grave one at a time. So from the very beginning, whoever needed to be buried, and this was the city cemetery from the very beginning.
I have a comment on that too. The most interesting one in Salt Lake is Mount Olivet.
Yeah.
Mount Olivet was created by Congress in 1879 or 69 maybe from the Fort Douglas military reservation on the basis that the Protestants didn't have a place to be buried because the Mormons wouldn't let them be buried in the Salt Lake City Cemetery. Literally, that was the basis for the creation of Mount Olivet. It is a spectacular cemetery. There are the best headstones. There's great history up there. It is worth a lot of time spending there. William Godbey is buried in Mount Olivet with two of his polygamous wives. One of his polygamous wives, when he left the church, dumped him and is buried in Salt Lake Cemetery. So there is that, but otherwise, I don't think they're that separate.
Should be a separate category. Cemeteries with their own deer herd.
Yeah, well, most Salt Lake and Mount Olivet have them.
I have relatives there. One evening at dusk, I was looking for my great-grandfather's grave, and I looked up and I was completely surrounded by deer. From me to this lady here, deer looking right at my face. They're not afraid of humans.
No,
they
not.
walk right up to you.
Yep.
Just 2 nights ago, we had a deer herd on our street. I'm just 2 blocks from the cemetery, and they were just walking down the street.
Yeah. Is that the Salt Lake City Cemetery?
Yes, the Salt Lake City Cemetery.
We have time for a couple more questions. Yes, please.
I thought I was told that the Reformed Jewish group could not be buried next to an Orthodox group, and then is it the Catholics that are between them, the Catholic part of the cemetery?
There are actually 3 Jewish cemetery areas, but one of them is up on 11th Avenue, but the other 2 are right next to each other.
No, they're separated.
They're separated.
That statue of Ralph Quinn is in the section between the Montefiore. They are separated. They're not
thought
next to each other.
we did a tour, and the lady said that the Reformed Jews and the Orthodox Jews could not be side by side, that they had to be separate.
I don't think Montefiore is Orthodox technically. I think it's a conservative congregation, which is different than Orthodox.
Okay.
Nevertheless, there is a space between the 2 historic Jewish cemeteries.
I didn't know that. I've been up there many, many times.
No,
I just thought they were just by each other.
No, my friend Ralph Quinn is in between them, and he was no Jew.
I will just comment that the Orthodox is the part that's on 11th Avenue.
Okay.
It's a much newer cemetery.
Yeah, that one is the Orthodox.
Yeah.
Any final question? Yes.
Mine's more of a comment. It's not really applying to Utah, but there's an interesting city in California that was established to move all the dead from San Francisco.
Yeah.
It's called Colma, California.
They're all over. Big cemeteries. They moved them all out in the 1930s.
Yeah, it's a city that was established for that reason. Kind of interesting.
Sure.
When I first walked in, you was talking about cemeteries in Europe. I was in Switzerland for a while, and what we found out was that the members of the Catholic Church were buried around the cathedrals in their towns. They were allowed to lay there for 10 years, and then they would dig them up and put their skull in a place they called Gefängnis, a prison.
Very different traditions in Europe, very different conditions as well in terms of population.
Do you have time for one more or not?
Yes.
Just real quick, I'm curious, we had that major mine disaster. Remember that?
Schofield?
Yeah, a lot of men were involved. Where are they at?
I think they're down in Schofield.
Yeah, they're scattered through 2 or 3 different cemeteries in Carbon County.
Yeah.
Okay. Because I've never been able to find out.
Several hundred of them were killed in the mine.
Okay, all right.
So I want to thank you all for coming. I do want to do a couple little plugs. For those who are interested in cemeteries, October 27th, Fort Douglas Military Cemetery will be hosting their annual cemetery tour. And I will be giving a tour to talk about the history of military headstone designs. Because again, so many different stories to tell, so many different things to be interested in cemeteries. And if any of you do Facebook, Utah State History has a Facebook page, and every Monday I post something about someone or who's buried in Utah, a little bit of their story, kind of like what you heard. This week I did Shonesburg, which is abandoned, it's no longer a town, right outside of Rockville. So I also highlight cemeteries people don't necessarily know. So if you're interested in those things, every week I try to post something that's of interest and historical value to tell our stories so that we don't forget those. I like to pick the people that most people would never have heard about, or if they didn't realize there was an association. One of my favorite in Mount Olivet that I told not too long ago was Lord Russell Tracy, who was buried in Mount Olivet, but who started Tracy Aviary, and I never knew that myself. Yeah. So I try to pick those really fun caveats. But again, I want to thank you all for coming. It was a great presentation from our 3 presenters, and have fun with the rest of the History Day, our conference. Thank you.